If you are feeling overwhelmed by the sheer firestorm of headlines, all the wild theories, and just the volume of outrage around the assassination of conservative activist Charlie Kirk, well, you are in exactly the right place.
Yeah, this event, it just fractured the American political landscape almost instantly. So much heat, maybe not enough light.
And today, we're aiming to fix that.
Our mission for this deep dive is really to give you the thinking tools, the KaiZen methodology for looking at current events, that you need to cut through all that noise.
We're going to unpack the raw facts, decode these really intense political narratives that sprang up, look at the shift toward political martyrdom, and dissect that free speech crackdown that followed. It was something else.
We're pulling insights from a whole stack of sources here. Official FBI and police testimony. There's really emotional memorial speeches, media analysis from places like the New York Times, Axios.
The works.
Right. The goal is to get you, the learner, quickly and thoroughly informed so you feel you have total command of this really complex story. Okay, first things first. We want to hear from you right now. When you first heard the news about Kirk, what hit you? Was it intense shock? Or maybe a feeling of numbness, like here we go again with political violence?
Yeah, don't overthink it. Just pause this right now. Type SHOCK or NUMB in the comments. Let us know how this huge event landed with you.
Seriously, do it now. We're watching those comments.
Okay, let's dive into the verified details, the facts on the ground.
Yeah.
Utah Valley University, September 10th, 2025. Charlie Kirk, described pretty much everywhere as a driving force in Trump's campaigns, definitely one of the biggest voices on the right. He was fatally shot while speaking, part of his American Comeback tour.
And the setting is really crucial here. He wasn't inside giving some formal speech. He was doing his usual thing. Right. Out there, very confrontational campus event.
That's proved me wrong, table.
Exactly. Sitting under a tent, debating gun violence of all things, a really contentious topic. So high visibility and, well, high risk, obviously.
And the authorities, Utah Department of Public Safety, the FBI, they didn't hesitate. They called it a targeted event right out of the gate.
Meaning the intent was specific. It was political. No question.
Now, the logistics of the attack, the details investigators pieced together, they really speak to a cold, calculated plan. The shooter, later ID'd as Tyler J. Robinson, college-aged, which adds this whole other layer.
Right, given the campus setting.
He arrives at 11:52 a.m. local time. Investigators tracked his movements, used stairwells, got to the roof of a nearby building.
Fired a single shot. Chilling precision.
And then just fled into an off-campus neighborhood nearby.
And that one shot, I mean, it just changed the political trajectory of the American right almost overnight. Kirk died soon after getting to Timpanogos Regional Hospital.
There was that detail circulating, too, that he was taken by a private vehicle, not an ambulance.
Right. His wife, Erica Kirk, she later shared some intimate details, saying his death was instant. She said there was no fear, no agony.
The suspect, Robinson, he was caught pretty quickly. A tip from a family member, apparently, was key.
And now, Utah prosecutors are going for the death penalty. Critically, they're explicitly alleging the targeting was because of Kirk's political views. That legal filing, that officially makes this a political killing in the eyes of the state.
So let's talk about Kirk himself and the machine he built. Before all this, he was a political powerhouse. You saw outlets like the New York Times calling him a kingmaker.
Definitely. Co-founder and CEO of Turning Point USA TPUSA, that conservative youth organization. They claimed chapters on, over 2,000 college and high school campuses?
Yeah, 2,000 plus. That's not just a club. That's a national infrastructure.
And that infrastructure was really cemented by his media presence, the Charlie Kirk Show podcast. This wasn't some niche thing. Back in 2024, it was getting 500,000 to 750,000 downloads a day.
Wow.
His whole strategy was campus activism, pushing that consistent America First conservative message to millions of young people, maybe people who felt left out by mainstream academia.
But that influence, it was built on a very specific style of communication, wasn't it? His brand was polarizing. The rhetoric was often incendiary.
Oh, absolutely. He set up his campus events less like dialogues and more like, provocative debates, unequal footing. The goal seemed to be, as sources put it, to verbally defeat liberal students.
Critics often said it was more about trolling, public humiliation than any real academic discussion.
And the sources give examples, right? Like arguing
that idea about transgender mass shooters? which lacked evidence.
Yeah, that style, it definitely fired up his base, but it was also incredibly corrosive to any kind of political consensus building.
This political approach, it also involves some pretty high stakes,
Mm-hmm.
which brings us to his history with the January 6th Select Committee.
Right. His political action arm, Turning Point Action, TPA, that's separate from the nonprofit TPUSA, they were involved in the January 6th rally planning.
Deeply involved. Sources show TPA planned to send 7 buses, about 350 people. There was even an invoice we saw cited over $211,000 for a January 6th build-out.
But here's the fascinating part, the legal maneuver. When the committee asked him about it,
He invoked the 5th.
exactly, pled the Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, refused to answer if TPA was involved in planning, refused to answer if he thought Trump incited violence, multiple times.
A major political figure pleading the 5th. That really underscores the legal risk in the current political climate, doesn't it?
It speaks volumes. It shows the perceived threat, the legal jeopardy felt by people involved in the events around January 6th.
It's a crucial detail. It shows Kirk was operating at the highest levels of political risk, kind of navigating that line between activism and potential legal trouble, way before the tragedy in Utah.
So we have the chilling facts of the killing, the targeted nature. But the very next phase of this story, it instantly shifted into this realm of religious and political myth-making. This is really where the narrative battle began.
Absolutely. That memorial service at State Farm Stadium in Arizona, wow. It wasn't just a funeral. Sources described it as this massive, meticulously planned spectacle.
A blend of evangelical revival and, well, a fierce political call to action.
And they were selling merchandise. That slogan, Make America Charlie Kirk. It sprang up incredibly fast.
The scale alone confirmed TPUSA's reach. Packed stadium, over 400,000 watching live just on YouTube. Millions of new followers for his channels right after his death. The tragedy immediately became fuel for the organization.
So the main goal of this huge event seemed to be establishing the martyr narrative, taking this polarizing, confrontational activist and making him into something sacred, unimpeachable.
And the political elite, they certainly delivered on that. Vice President J.D. Vance called Kirk a hero and a martyr for the Christian faith.
Andrew Colvett, the TPUSA spokesperson, went even further, called him a prophet, and deliberately reframed those combative campus events as modern tent revivals.
That linguistic shift, that's key for our deep dive here.
Yeah.
How quickly did the activist become the saint? It's a powerful tool for political mobilization.
How so?
Well, when you label someone a martyr, you instantly lift their cause beyond simple policy disagreements, right? It becomes almost a holy war against the forces, the ideas that supposedly killed him. It validates the whole conflict as moral, spiritual.
Which brings us to that central tension at the memorial, this really profound conflict between, let's say, spiritual forgiveness and political retribution. Erica Kirk gave this incredibly emotional speech that went viral instantly.
Yeah, she pledged to carry on his movement, but then she very explicitly said she forgave the killer, Tyler Robinson, said she didn't want that man's blood on my ledger.
She framed it very much through a Christian lens, didn't she? Emphasizing limitless forgiveness, conquering evil with good, quoting Isaiah, "Here I am, Lord, send me."
It was a powerful, personal, spiritual statement. Grace in the face of just immense loss.
But then, that message of grace was immediately and very dramatically undercut by her husband's key political allies. President Trump spoke right after her.
And the sources noted how jarring that transition was. Trump basically told the crowd, that's where I disagreed with Charlie. I hate my opponent and I don't want the best for them.
He acknowledged her position, but then just doubled down, said something like, "I'm sorry, Erica. Maybe they can convince me that's not right, but I cannot stand my opponent."
That tension is just strategically fascinating. Why did Trump feel he had to immediately override that message of grace with political vengeance?
Because vengeance mobilizes the base.
Exactly. For the movement, vengeance is mobilization. And it escalated even more with Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller. His speech was fiery, unambiguous, a call to war.
"You have no idea the dragon you have awakened." That line stood out.
Vowing to prevail over wickedness and evil, and specifically to destroy progressive groups in Kirk's name.
So you have this stark contrast. Erica Kirk representing the personal, spiritual act of forgiveness.
And Trump and Miller representing the political, collective demand for, essentially, annihilation of the enemy. The source material even brought up how different theological traditions view this, like a cited approach in Judaism commanding hatred of unrepentant evildoers versus the Christian ideal of limitless grace.
It really shows how hard it is to inject that personal, spiritual ideal like forgiveness into this collective public political sphere that's just driven by power and conflict.
And Erica Kirk also spoke about their personal life, describing their marriage as an Ephesians 5 marriage.
For our audience, that references a very traditional, some would say hierarchical, view of gender roles from the Bible. Wife submits, husband serves and leads.
Right. She mentioned he wrote her weekly love notes asking how he could better serve her, framing it as mutual commitment within that specific traditional structure.
And this personal context tied back to the organization's mission, right?
Yeah.
She emphasized his goal was aimed squarely at the lost boys of the West.
Yeah, young men feeling directionless, maybe filled with resentment, anger, and hate. TPUSA's pitch was offering them Christian values, a sense of purpose. More than just politics, it was framed as a kind of conservative social and spiritual rehabilitation effort.
And the market, so to speak, responded. The tragedy acted almost like a hyper-efficient customer acquisition strategy.
The numbers are staggering. In the days right after his death, TPUSA saw this unprecedented surge. 62,000 new student signups.
Wow.
32,000 inquiries about starting new chapters across their, 3,500 plus campuses. Donations topped $6 million almost immediately.
So the assassination didn't just continue the movement.
It instantly supercharged it, made it even more dominant.
Okay, we really want you to pause and think about this. Are political memorials always political rallies? Just type Y for yes or N for no in the comments right now. Let's see what you think.
Yeah, quick poll. Y or N? Do it now.
All right, so that immediate vacuum of verified facts around the killing,
Yeah.
it created the perfect storm for misinformation, didn't it?
Absolutely. That initial 48-hour gap, that's always the danger zone in a crisis. People rush to fill the void, often with narratives that fit their existing biases. The New York Times noted the sheer scale of the wild speculation online.
And it's not just fringe users anymore. We saw analysis, I think, from CBS News noting how AI is accelerating this, rapidly generating and spreading false claims. It's a dangerous new dynamic.
Yeah, definitely. And two main narratives, which were quickly debunked, popped up almost immediately. Both tried to link the shooter, Robinson, to one of Kirk's existing political fights.
Okay, what were they?
First was the transgender link. Theories spread like wildfire, speculating Robinson was motivated by Kirk's really strong rhetoric against trans people. The claim was the shooter allegedly had a transgender partner.
But that was baseless.
Completely. Experts like J.C. Thornton from Rainbow, Utah, called it out immediately, said it was stretching to find a way to tie this into the trans community, harmful speculation, basically blaming the other without any evidence.
Okay, what was the second theory?
The Groyper theory. This one came from the other side, sort of. Users speculated the shooter was linked to the far-right Groyper movement, led by Nick Fuentes.
Weren't they political enemies of Kirk? They used to heckle his events, right?
Exactly. They saw Kirk as not extreme enough, basically. But the theory was they might have been involved. Axios called these claims baseless. Fuentes himself denied it, claimed his followers were being framed.
So in both cases, people were immediately trying to make the facts fit their preferred narrative. Blame the group Kirk attacked or blame a rival conservative faction.
It's a critical lesson in information decoding for you, the listener. Crisis equals conflict. People will twist facts to fit narratives. You have to wait for verification.
And beyond these immediate theories, we need to put social media's role in spreading violent talk into context. It's not entirely new.
No, not at all. Analysis reminded us that a decade ago, groups like ISIS were using platforms to post graphic beheadings, shootings.
Which led companies like Meta, Facebook back then to put in some measures, content warnings, age restrictions.
Incremental steps, yeah. But now we see this contrast. X, formerly Twitter, has taken a much more, let's say, hands-off approach to moderation compared to Meta.
And that complicates things when you have violent narratives or calls for more violent spreading.
Hugely. We saw it immediately after Kirk's death. People on platforms like Bluesky posting things celebrating his death, even saying stuff like, "Do Trump next," or "Elon next, please."
Oh.
So platforms are grappling with this line between arguably protected, though awful, political speech versus actual threats, especially against high-profile figures.
This whole tragic event definitely pushed the broader issue of political violence in the U.S. back into the spotlight.
No doubt. And the public is deeply concerned. That YouGov poll right after Kirk's killing, 87% agreed political violence is a serious problem here. 87%.
And if we look at the long-term data, the impartial context is really important here. Multiple nonpartisan studies show a higher rate of right-wing political violence compared to left-wing, going back decades to 1975.
And even more pointedly, Data from just 2022 to 2024 showed that all 61 political killings in that period were committed by right-wing extremists.
That data seems to directly contradict President Trump's immediate reaction, where he blamed a radical left's group of lunatics.
It does. The data compels us to look at the threat complexity impartially, not just react based on political alignment.
There was also that insight from counterterrorism experts, linking political pardons for January 6th attackers to creating a sort of permission structure.
Yeah, that's a really critical point. The argument is when political leaders signal that violence done in their name might go unpunished or even be rewarded with pardons, it can normalize it. It might inadvertently encourage future political violence.
It suggests this long-term cycle between rhetoric, perceived impunity, and actual violence.
Exactly. It's not just about one event, it's about the environment that allows it to happen.
We've covered a lot on the theories and context. If that data on political violence surprised you, or if you have questions, pause and share them in the comments right now. We want to hear your take.
Okay, this next part. This is where the analysis gets really profound and, frankly, pretty chilling. In the immediate aftermath of the assassination, we saw this aggressive, top-down campaign from prominent conservatives to crack down on speech. Any speech critical of Kirk or perceived as celebrating his death.
The speed and breadth were just breathtaking.
And the irony here is just massive. The tactical flip-flop on rhetoric. You had Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller promising the federal government would use its power to identify, disrupt, dismantle, and destroy left-wing nonprofits and political groups.
At the same time, Attorney General Pam Bondi indicated she'd target speech against Kirk as hate speech.
And critics immediately jumped on this, calling it a conservative version of the cancel culture that only a few years ago was wielded by the American left.
It highlights the rise of what some are calling a woke right, a faction focused not just on winning arguments, but on actively punishing opponents for their speech.
Yeah.
Especially speech seen as disrespectful to Kirk's memory.
It really does raise that fundamental question about power in speech. Okay, listener interaction time. Do you think the definition of hate speech just changes depending on who's holding the levers of power? Type okay if you think it's fluid based on who's in charge, or write no if you believe it should be a stable legal standard. Let us know, okay or no.
And this wasn't just talk. The punishment for critical speech was real, swift, and broad. The highest profile case was Jimmy Kimmel Live being indefinitely suspended by ABC.
What exactly did Kimmel say?
He essentially blamed Trump for not uniting the country after the assassination and accused the Maggie gang, as he put it, of trying to score political points from the tragedy.
And the hammer came down hard. FCC Chief Brendan Carr threatened action against ABC, even mentioning revoking broadcast licenses.
The Nexstar Media Group, which owns a ton of ABC affiliates, 32 of them, they preempted Kimmel's show. And crucially, they were trying to get FCC approval for a huge multi-billion-dollar acquisition at the time.
The pressure point.
Exactly. So ABC, facing regulatory threats, potential financial damage, they pulled the plug. Suspended the show indefinitely. Trump even publicly mused about the FCC revoking licenses for critical broadcasters. The threat was explicit.
That's a direct assault on press freedom. Clear attempt at institutional censorship, way beyond normal political back and forth.
And it didn't stop there. A Secret Service agent got put on leave, clearance revoked, for a negative Facebook post about Kirk.
Nearly 300 teachers in Texas put under investigation for comments they made.
We even saw reports of a student expelled and arrested at Texas Tech for arguing with someone holding an RIP Kirk sign.
And it went global. A stylist in Brazil, a council member in the UK, fired or investigated for critical posts. The reach was incredible.
Legal experts were sounding the alarm bells loud and clear, said it sets an extremely dangerous precedent.
First Amendment lawyers basically said the government, including the FCC, has no constitutional right to police content or punish broadcasters just because it dislikes their speech.
The ACLU called the Kimmel suspension beyond McCarthyism. That's strong language.
It reflects that deep concern that lawmakers are essentially redefining hate speech as simply speech I disagree with, making the First Amendment only really protect those in power at that moment.
Okay, now for the final layer of irony here.
Yeah.
We have to remember Kirk's own institutional legacy in this debate.
Right. TPUSA itself launched the professor watch list and the school board watch list.
These were campaigns specifically designed to publish names and photos of academics, school officials, anyone promoting ideas they deemed too liberal or anti-racist, basically targeting people for their views.
So while free speech groups absolutely condemned Kirk's assassination, they couldn't help but note the deep irony. Kirk built his entire brand around campus debate, but often in a way that seemed designed to provoke, humiliate, and ultimately professionally target his opponents.
And now the movement he led is using state power to aggressively censor critics, mirroring the very tactics of antagonism and targeting he championed.
It's the ultimate paradox, isn't it? Fighting cancel culture by becoming the biggest cancelers backed by the power of the state.
Let's pivot now to the machine Kirk built, TPUSA, and the ideology that really powered it. He definitely succeeded in making TPUSA the biggest campus conservative group out there.
And he had that ambitious goal, right? Shifting the youth vote at least 10 points toward Republicans by the 2024 election.
That kind of success, it takes infrastructure and it takes money. Serious money.
Yeah, TPUSA and its political arm, TPA, the Pay Up PAC, focused on elections. They're heavily funded by wealthy, well-connected Republican donors, but a lot of it flows through what they call dark money vehicles.
Like the Donors Trust.
Exactly. For listeners maybe not familiar, Donors Trust is basically set up to shield the identities of donors. It allows huge anonymous contributions to flow into politically active conservative groups.
So the people funding PPA's push to re-elect Trump in 2020, for example, could remain anonymous.
Precisely. It allows powerful figures to exert influence without public scrutiny. Kirk built this massive, sophisticated political operation funded significantly by anonymous capital.
And his media work wasn't just about elections. He spent a lot of time tearing down liberal institutions, especially with his college scam critique.
Oh yeah, he argued really forcefully against the traditional four-year degree, called it a federally sponsored scam designed mainly to indoctrinate students with liberal ideas.
He accused universities of defrauding young people, linking rising tuition, student debt, administrative bloat, all back to government-backed loans insulating colleges from market forces.
His advice was practical from his perspective. Minimize debt, go into trades, take a gap year. Basically framing higher ed as this corrupt tool of the cultural left, actively harming young conservatives.
Okay, finally, let's dig into the core of his later politics. Christian nationalism.
This became increasingly central. He explicitly embraced it, even setting up Turning Point Faith to formally fuse evangelical activism with right-wing politics.
He wasn't shy about it either. Dismissed church-state separation as a myth. Endorsed theocratic ideas like the Seven Mountains Mandate.
Yeah, for our listeners, the Seven Mountains Mandate is a specific dominionist idea. It holds that Christians are commanded by God to take control of 7 key areas of society, government, media, education, arts, family, religion, business, to establish a biblical society.
So that was the strategic underpinning for a lot of his cultural battles.
It seems to be, yes. It provides a theological justification for seeking political and cultural dominance.
And his policy views flowed directly from this worldview, especially on social issues. Abortion.
Strongly opposed, called it murder, compared it to the Holocaust, and importantly, opposed exceptions even for rape or for children as young as 10, an absolute stance based on life at conception.
Gender roles.
Very traditional. Advocated for the biblical model, women as virtuous partners, mothers supporting husbands who are protectors and leaders. His wife Erica's clothing brand, Proclaim Streetwear, targets Proverbs 31 girls, referencing that biblical chapter promoting traditional femininity.
He also made controversial claims about birth control.
Yeah, claiming it screws up female brains. Highly controversial statement.
And on race and DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Equally provocative rhetoric, called DEI programs anti-white. Controversially argued that white people are more likely to be attacked by black individuals in the U.S.
And there was that really jarring claim blaming the high death toll in the Central Texas floods on DEI.
Yes, arguing qualified engineers were replaced by unqualified staff due to race-based hiring, a claim that drew immediate, strong rebuttals.
So his ideology wasn't accidental.
Ew.
It was this consistent system, rooted in Christian nationalism, designed to mobilize a specific base by offering strong, absolute answers.
Right. It was the engine driving the whole political machine he built. Hashtag tag outro.
Okay, so this deep dive hopefully has helped you use those KaiZen decoding tools effectively. We've gone from the tragic facts of the killing
To the political mobilization, that tension between forgiveness and vengeance.
track the speed of media narratives, and expose that really chilling, hypocritical crackdown on free speech that followed.
We saw how Charlie Kirk's death instantly turned a divisive figure into a martyr, and maybe more importantly, into a catalyst, a very effective one.
His assassination became the justification for silencing dissent, with leaders using the very cancel culture tactics they claim to oppose, vowing to identify, disrupt, dismantle, and destroy their opponents.
It's a potent case study in American political polarization. The enduring question, the one you, our informed listener, really need to grapple with, is this.
In this digital age, where rhetoric is already so corrosive, where every tragedy gets instantly weaponized, how do we marshal passion for political causes in a way that preserves dignity, that encourages evidence-based policy?
And crucially, how do we keep the channels open for democratic persuasion rather than just escalating conflict perpetually?
It's a huge question.
It really is. If this deep dive helped you understand the many layers here, helped arm you to analyze future crises, please join our community now.
Make sure you're following us right now for more deep dives into the topics that matter.
And share your final thoughts. What did you think about that free speech paradox we uncovered? Write your comment immediately below. Let's keep this conversation going.
Okay, so this critique looks at the aftermath of the Charlie Kirk assassination, the conspiracy theories, the media narratives, and how we can use critical thinking to sort of decode that political firestorm.
Right.
And what I really liked right off the bat is how you grasped the key themes. You really identified the core questions that, well, everyone's asking.
Mm-hmm.
The strength is seeing this wasn't just a crime, it was bigger, a real turning point, in American political culture.
Yeah, that's laid out clearly. I do wonder, though, have we thought about how maybe shifting the focus just a bit could make the core argument even sharper?
Okay.
Your goal seems to be analyzing this pivotal moment, but often these moments aren't really defined by the incident itself.
Right.
They're defined more by the scale of the institutional reaction,
That makes sense.
So let's look closely at where the biggest opportunities are.
How to take this from good observation to something really definitive.
Absolutely. Let's start there with the big picture, the overall frame.
Okay, so first point. To really maximize the significance here, the analysis needs to pivot. Move from the tragedy of Kirk's death itself to the systemic response that came after, that unprecedented institutional reaction.
Right. And the weakness we sort of see in the current draft is that it risks treating the assassination as this singular, awful event, almost like just another headline about, violent content online.
Which minimizes the political analysis.
Exactly. Instead of seeing it immediately as the catalyst, the thing that kicked off this sweeping political, institutional crackdown on dissent, on speech.
And that political scale, that's the real so what here, isn't it, for any serious analysis?
Yeah.
If the goal is decoding a political firestorm, well, the firestorm isn't just the shooting. It's the actions taken afterwards to essentially enforce ideological control.
Okay, so the suggestion is pretty straightforward then. Reframe it. Center the analysis on the aftermath as the main story.
Yes.
Detail exactly how officials, high-ranking ones, instantly leverage the event to target speech, target political opponents. Across different sectors, too.
And to make that really actionable, you need specifics. We have to clearly contrast the expected bipartisan condemnation of the violence.
Right. Everyone condemned it.
With the swift, very targeted disciplinary actions that followed against critics. We need actual data points, not just generalizations.
Like, for instance, the chilling effect you saw in major media. Think about Jimmy Kimmel Live getting suspended indefinitely.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't just a network decision about ratings, right?
Yeah.
It came after direct, high-level threats from the FCC chair, Brendan Carr. He accused Kimmel of, quote, directly misleading the American public.
That's government officials using regulatory power right away to influence content creators. Huge.
Yeah, and building on that, what about what happened with jobs? You saw Matthew Dowd, the MSNBC analyst,
Fired almost immediately.
right after calling Kirk divisive and basically saying hateful words can lead to hateful actions. He was criticizing Kirk, sure, but the implication for the media world, it's enormous.
It shows just how fast employers moved to enforce a certain line, even for commentary that was, arguably factual.
And it wasn't just the big media pundits either. That sets a tone. But the crackdown went deeper into public institutions, which arguably have an even broader impact on society.
Oh, absolutely. You had Governor Greg Abbott saying nearly 300 teachers in Texas alone were under investigation for things they said criticizing Kirk.
Wow.
And multiple school districts confirm they fired people, put educators on leave, K-12 teachers for comments they made online.
Targeting teachers. That's a powerful political move.
It sends a crystal clear message about conformity right into communities, into public education.
So analyzing that, how the tragedy was weaponized to enforce ideological lines in media, in education, that's the highest value critique you can offer here.
Exactly. The story isn't just the tragic death. It's the systemic response designed to reshape public discourse. And focusing there gives us hard, verifiable data points.
Okay.
But analyzing hard data means knowing how to filter out the noise. Which brings us right to the second critique, because the analysis spent maybe a bit too much valuable time on, well, low-signal rumors.
I agree completely. So, critique 2. The section on information decoding needs to prioritize the verifiable impacts, things like organizational shifts, financial changes, over the speculative, low-signal conspiracy stuff like the whole no autopsy debate.
You mentioned wanting to use critical thinking tools, right? And the most important use of those tools is ruthlessly separating signal from noise.
Mm-hmm.
The weakness we saw, and it's a common trap, especially with emotional events, is getting drawn into exploring the sensational theories.
Like whether an autopsy happened or all the online speculation about the shooter.
Right. When you dig deep into those, you risk diluting the real analytical signal. You give oxygen to rumors, and that distracts from the verifiable data. The data that actually explains the political and organizational consequences.
That's a really strong analytical line. I wonder, though, is there a small risk that if we ignore the rumors completely, we miss a chance to explain why the other data is more important? I mean, conspiracy theories are part of the landscape now.
That's fair. That's a really good point. We don't need to dwell on them, no. But maybe use the rumor as a contrast.
Okay.
Just a quick mention to show how weak that low-signal stuff is. Then immediately pivot to the strength of the verifiable organizational response, like a quick setup and punchline.
Got it. So, the suggestion is, apply those critical thinking tools immediately. Distinguish the internet rumors from the solid organizational consequences. Emphasize the immediate tangible effects on Turning Point USA, Kirk's huge, $85 million ecosystem.
So instead of spending paragraphs on those no autopsy videos circulating online,
Right.
you foreground the verifiable data points, the ones that show lasting institutional impact. That's the real story of how power continues.
And we have incredibly clear high-signal data here. It's astonishing, really.
Yeah, look at the immediate surge in engagement. TPUSA itself reported getting over 62,000 requests from students wanting to start chapters or get involved right after the assassination.
62,000.
That's a massive quantifiable gain for them. That number tells you so much about the political momentum generated by this.
And then there's the leadership transition, also very quick.
Erica Kirk takes over as CEO, and she's known for advocating that women prioritize family over career, a core conservative Christian theme.
So that transition immediately locks in the organization's alignment with its, hard-right Christian nationalist vision.
It's an undeniable change in the power structure, and that's far more relevant than any theory about the shooter's clothes or motivations or whatever else was flying around online.
Right. Analyzing how big organizations respond structurally, looking at the money, the leadership, the mobilization, that's high-value critique.
Exactly. Chasing YouTube theories about conflicting reports on the victim's remains, it might feel dramatic, but it adds zero to understanding the political aftermath. Focus on the money and the movement.
That brings the necessary discipline to the information decoding part. Okay, so for our third and final critique, let's look at the memorial narrative, how to structure that for maximum analytical impact.
Right. To get the most robustness here, the analysis of Erica Kirk's public forgiveness needs to be framed as a study in political dissonance.
Okay, dissonance. Explain that.
It means clearly juxtaposing the spiritual narrative, the forgiveness, against the political calls for vengeance that were happening literally right around it on the same stage.
Ah, okay. Because just reporting her statement, I forgive him, kind of overlooks the massive political contradiction happening in that moment.
Precisely. This act of personal Christian grace, it happened in an environment where Homeland Security classified the entire memorial as an event of highest national significance.
Right, with massive security, barriers.
Exactly. So you have this institutional fear clashing directly with personal faith. That context, that clash, is the core analytical challenge.
The audience needs to see that contradiction laid bare.
Yes, so our suggestion is organize this discussion around that sharp, specific public contradiction. Use the recorded remarks from the stage during the memorial. It's almost a textbook case of political messaging overriding or at least overshadowing a deeply personal faith statement.
So we need to explicitly highlight the dissonance, contrast Erica Kirk's emotional address forgiving the young man with what the political figure said right before and after her.
Yes. Think about Vice President J.D. Vance. His warning that society shouldn't ignore evil for a fake kumbaya moment.
Directly undercutting the forgiveness she just offered. Moments later,
It strongly suggests a political power structure saw forgiveness as, what, a weakness? A strategic risk?
and maybe even more starkly, President Trump declaring, "I hate my opponents and I don't want the best for them."
Right. Directly opposing the theme of forgiveness, loving your enemies, even while praising Kirk for trying to be a missionary to young people. The contradiction is potent.
Wow, yeah.
So the core point is, this public display of forgiveness was immediately politicized, either held up as this beautiful example of Christian strength, or, as the political speakers demonstrated right there, used almost as cover to deliver calls for retaliation, censorship, dismantling progressive groups.
Analyzing that as political dissonance, that collision between, the Sermon on the Mount and the MAGA movement's calls for righteous fury, that's the most sophisticated, most enduring way to handle that really high-stakes material.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. You really have all the pieces for a deeply insightful analysis here. They just need a bit more analytical precision in how they're assembled.
Yeah.
So we've covered 3 big areas: pivoting the focus to the systemic political crackdown, prioritizing those verifiable organizational metrics over the speculative stuff, and structuring the forgiveness narrative as a study in high-stakes political dissonance.
Exactly. And the core actionable suggestions are really about leveraging those high-signal data points.
Right.
That huge surge in TPUSA engagement, the clear public contradictions in the political rhetoric from the memorial stage. Use those to make the analysis definitive. Those adjustments will make the work not just robust, but genuinely insightful into this really pivotal moment in American politics.
Well, we invite you to implement these suggestions. Rework the analysis, and please send it back for another critique if you'd like. We'd look forward to seeing the deeper conclusions you draw.
Welcome to the debate. We are diving immediately into the raw, frankly shocking aftermath of the assassination of Charlie Kirk. This event, it instantly pivoted the trajectory of American political discourse. And the material we have, all the reports, the statements, it gives us, and especially you, our brilliant KaiZen community, a crucial chance to decode information under, well, extreme pressure. We're not just revisiting a tragedy here, we're analyzing the systemic reaction. So the central question, the one that really defines the future of the American experiment, is this: which poses the greater long-term danger, the physical act of targeted political violence itself, or the ensuing very rapid political mobilization designed to control the public narrative and fundamentally silence dissent? Now, I'll be arguing that the primary focus must remain fixed on condemning and containing that immediate threat of violence. We had to secure our political environment first.
And I think that perspective, while understandable, fundamentally misunderstands where the real structural damage lies. Look, the assassination was horrific, a devastating criminal act, no question. But the long-term threat, I believe, is the widespread organized crackdown on civil liberties that followed almost immediately. I'll argue that the political machine used this tragedy as an immediate and frankly cynical pretext to justify suppressing political criticism. And that represents a far more profound, more insidious erosion of democratic norms than the terrible act of one disturbed individual. If you agree that the response was the greater danger, seriously, give us a why in the comments right now. Let us know.
Okay. But I think your focus on the reaction minimizes the original sin, if you will. We have to start with the severity and the intent of the crime itself. The FBI didn't speculate. Their official characterization of the Utah Valley University shooting was a targeted event. That's specific. Kurt Wallace was killed while he was actively engaged in public debate. A crystal clear signal that the high-risk environment facing political speakers had boiled over into fatal aggression. And furthermore, the threat didn't just stop with his death. We saw users immediately celebrating the murder on platforms like Blue Sky, even inciting further violence, posting things like "Do Trump next" or "Elon next, please," explicitly. So when political conflict spills into documented bloodshed like this, and threats escalate online, the rapid, decisive actions taken by authorities, by institutions to contain that epidemic of violence, they aren't just justified. They are a necessary function of government, protecting order.
See, that view places, I think, far too much weight on the perceived necessity of the response, and it ignores how quickly those containment efforts morphed into institutionalized censorship. Just look at the specific structural actions. We saw Jimmy Kimmel Live, a major network show, pulled off the air, indefinitely suspended. And why? Because the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, allegedly threatened ABC's broadcast licenses. Now, that wasn't just about protecting people from online threats. This was governmental allies directly silencing one of the biggest dissenting voices in entertainment, someone who dared question the preferred political narrative. That's an act of state coercion, a direct threat against the very infrastructure of free media. That goes way beyond simple containment.
And what about the resilience of the movement Kirk represented? Erica Kirk, his widow, and her allies, they have every right to define this tragedy on their own terms. The leadership of Turning Point USA stated, and this is a quote, that the attempt to destroy Charlie's work will become their chance to make it more powerful and enduring than ever before. This immediate mobilization, it's a defensive strategy. It's about turning horror into action, ensuring the legacy of the martyr is not defined by the bullet, but by the mission he stood for. To just dismiss this as cynical co-option is, I think, to deny them agency in the face of what was undeniably brutal political terrorism.
I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning because the mobilization immediately prioritized purging critics over, say, upholding civic discourse. We're talking about systemic action here, not just, platform moderation of nasty comments. We saw nearly 300 Texas teachers, citizens, employed by the state or state-affiliated institutions placed under investigation, some fired, for criticizing Kirk online. Students at Texas universities were expelled simply for mocking the death. Now, that doesn't sound like a defensive strategy to me. That sounds like a state-supported purge of critical voices. This moves far, far beyond maintaining civil order. This is weaponizing grief, and it smells strongly of a political loyalty test designed to enforce ideological conformity. That's the danger I'm pointing to. Okay, let's pivot to the very first moments of the crisis, because before they could launch this aggressive crackdown you're defending, they needed to impose a narrative. But the initial information environment, it was pure chaos. And I really don't buy that clarity was the immediate priority. We saw conflicting reports circulating almost instantly. Critically, there was that whole public discussion about whether a formal autopsy had even occurred, or why it might have been delayed. That fueled immediate suspicion, conspiracy theories right off the bat. We also saw the FBI news conference get postponed, citing rapid developments. Then the media quickly moved to dismiss specific claims, like any potential links between the shooter and certain far-right elements, or the Groyper culture, that term for white nationalist internet groups, branding them as baseless. This lack of initial, verifiable clarity created an information vacuum, and that made the subsequent political narrative, blaming the radical left group of lunatics, launching crackdowns, exponentially easier to impose on a stunned, confused public, don't you think?
Well, I think you're conflating procedural complexity, which is common in major incidents, with some kind of intentional deception. The official central facts, they did emerge relatively quickly. They established the violence as targeted and as politically motivated. A suspect was identified. The FBI confirmed the targeted nature. Prosecutors stated the shooter had become politically motivated, reported leaning more to the left, becoming more pro-gay and trans rights-oriented, citing a text message suggesting he, quote, had enough of Kirk's perceived hatred. Now, yes, were there procedural complexities? Absolutely. The fact that the victim was transported from the scene by a private vehicle, not an ambulance, certainly complicated immediate forensic procedures. But the core reality of the political act itself, that remained constant. The political response was reacting to a proven act of violence, not inventing a crisis from some imaginary information gap. The need for security, for immediate accountability, for what was clearly an act of domestic political terror, it far outweighed the need for immediate, granular forensic disclosure in those first hours. We have to remember, clarity in an active, unfolding situation is a process, not an instant command.
But the goal wasn't just security. It was narrative control. And that brings us straight to what I see as the most corrosive element: the systemic crackdown on protected dissent. And if you are tracking this complex decoding process with us, hit like right now. Let us know you're following along.
Look, I defend the disciplinary actions, the firings, the expulsions, as necessary social consequences for speech that celebrates murder or actively incites further violence. The First Amendment protects speech, absolutely, but it has never protected genuine incitement or hate speech that encourages political bloodshed. That's a well-established legal line. Consider the U.S. Secret Service putting one of its own agents on leave, revoking his security clearance just for expressing negative opinions about Kirk on Facebook, saying Kirk had, quote, spewed hate and racism. That action, by a key federal agency no less, establishes a critical standard. You cannot hold positions of power, particularly in security or government, while publicly endorsing sentiment that is profoundly disruptive or seems to celebrate violence right after a political assassination. This is about maintaining a functional, respectful public sector environment.
Okay, that's a compelling defense on the surface, but it collapses the critical legal distinction between unprotected incitement, which actually has an extremely high legal bar to meet, and protected, albeit offensive, political speech. When Vice President Vance, speaking on Kirk's own podcast network no less, doesn't just condemn violence, but calls for the dismantling of progressive organizations like the Open Society Foundations and actively encourages Americans to report uncivil speech, his word, to their employers for termination, well, that's the apparatus of the state mobilizing a private army of censorship. That's different.
I still think drawing a parallel to McCarthyism is, frankly, hyperbolic and inaccurate. McCarthyism was a state-led purge directed specifically at government loyalty, alleged communist infiltration. What we saw here largely were private and institutional entities reacting to public pressure and sentiment. That's a significant, legally defined distinction.
Hyperbolic, legal experts, dissenting voices like FCC Commissioner Gomez, even Tucker Carlson, from a different perspective, immediately warned this was an unconstitutional crackdown on dissent. The American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, they called the systemic response beyond McCarthyism. Why? Because it wasn't just the government acting alone. It was the government coercing private and educational institutions. When Governor Greg Abbott in Texas publicly condemns students who merely mocked the death, and then those students get expelled, sometimes even arrested, well, the state's heavy involvement makes the whole private employer decision defense fall apart. We should be deeply worried when political power is used to get hundreds of citizens fired, to try and dismantle legitimate organizations, simply for expressing uncivil opinions. That is the long-term cancer on the American system, the chilling effect, the fear of speaking openly. And this is the ultimate decoder tool for our audience. Understanding how quickly political power can collapse, that high legal wall between protected offensive speech and truly unprotected incitement.
All right, let's shift focus for a moment to a powerful dimension that speaks directly to the morality and authenticity of the response, the role of forgiveness.
Yes, and this is where the political machine's hypocrisy, I think, is most exposed. Erica Kirk's emotional address at the memorial, it was perhaps the most defining, powerful moment of the entire event. She spoke of profound Christ-like forgiveness. She said, quote, "I forgive him," and that she would refuse to hate or want revenge. Her focus was entirely on carrying on the mission, based on faith. It was an appeal to the highest moral and spiritual ground imaginable in that moment. Yet the political apparatus, the very people claiming to uphold Kirk's legacy,
They immediately discarded that message. President Trump declared, quote, "I hate my opponents and I don't want the best for them." Vice President Vance argued they shouldn't ignore it for a fake kumbaya moment. This stark contrast, it just highlights how quickly the political machine leveraged personal grief for raw political advantage, for retribution, discarding the spiritual core the moment it wasn't convenient for censorship and political consolidation.
See, I think you are fundamentally conflating a deeply personal spiritual act with the independent requirement for civil justice and public order. Erica Kirk herself framed her act of forgiveness as purely personal, achieved, in her words, only by the grace, the power, and the strength of God. Forgiveness, in both theological and legal contexts, it doesn't negate the requirement for justice. Religious scholars, legal scholars, they've noted this for centuries. The killer faces the death penalty. That is the pursuit of justice and accountability, which is mandatory to uphold the rule of law and send a clear message against political violence. Her personal faith provides spiritual peace for her, but the state must still pursue the required legal consequences for the act. These concepts are entirely separate and they're consistent. You can forgive the soul of the perpetrator while simultaneously demanding necessary secular justice for the crime committed against the political environment, against society.
But the issue isn't just whether justice should be pursued legally, it's the rhetoric used by the political allies that matters in this context. When the political machine actively champions the martyr narrative but simultaneously explicitly rejects the martyr's widow's message of mercy and forgiveness, well, they reveal that their true motivation is political retaliation, not moral consistency or even spiritual alignment. That disparity, the public rejection of forgiveness in favor of retribution, is what, in my view, helped justify the subsequent crackdown and fundamentally undermined any message of unity or higher purpose. And if this conflict resonates with you, if you see that tension, share this conversation right now. We really want the world decoding this complex situation with us.
So, in summarizing my position, the assassination of Charlie Kirk represented the most immediate and profound danger to the American experiment. Targeted political violence hitting a major public figure. The threat was real, the FBI confirmed its targeted nature, and the resulting unified, powerful narrative response, though yes, imperfect and incredibly swift, was, I argue, essential to maintain order, to secure the political environment, and frankly, to memorialize Kirk's immense influence as a victim of ideological aggression. We must prioritize security and accountability when political violence breaks the foundational rules of democracy.
And I maintain that the reaction was the dangerous overreach. The political machine exploited a national tragedy to implement an unprecedented and systemic program of political censorship and narrative control, fundamentally eroding free speech and dissent in the process. When government figures actively encourage the public to report their neighbors, their colleagues, to employers for merely uncivil comments, we have crossed a dangerous structural line that guarantees fear and silence, not lasting security.
The political violence was the direct attack on the structure of our public life.
And the censorship was the long-term self-inflicted wound to our liberty.
Okay, the material clearly presents two powerful, competing narratives here, KaiZen community. One focused on the tragic loss, the political motivation of the killer, justifying that security-first response. And another focusing on the subsequent political co-option, the suppression of free expression. Both interpretations, importantly, rest on specific factual evidence that emerged in the aftermath.
So we urge you, our brilliant critical thinkers here at KaiZen, to weigh these competing priorities. What price is actually too high to pay for security? And where exactly does narrative control cross that unforgivable line into outright censorship?
Engage with this complex issue right now. If you agree that the threat of targeted political violence must be the absolute priority, that accountability matters most, write accountability in the comments. Seriously, do it now. And hey, hit that follow button immediately while you're at it.
And if you agree that the crackdown on speech, the erosion of liberties, is actually the greater long-term threat, write free speech in the comments. Either way, thank you for being the most crucial part of KaiZen. Until next time, keep thinking critically and keep decoding the information all around you.
A high-profile political assassination. It's caught on video, goes global in, what, minutes? That's the headline. But the real shock, the thing that grabbed us, It's the contradiction right after Charlie Kirk's murder, September 10th, 2025.
Yeah, it wasn't just grief, was it? It was something else entirely. You had his widow, Erica Kirk, offering this really profound Christian forgiveness for the killer.
Right, on one hand. But then, almost in the same breath, you have the President of the United States on that same memorial stage.
Demanding political vengeance, calling for ideological conformity. It was whiplash, basically. A single tragedy splitting the country right down these deep fault lines we already knew were there. Faith, justice, media control, free speech.
It all just erupted, and the noise, well, it got deafening pretty fast, didn't it? Making it hard to see what actually happened, who was doing what behind the scenes.
Exactly. And that's why this deep dive is so crucial. We're really glad you, the critical thinker, decided to join us for this. We've pulled together a ton of sources, news articles, legal docs, official statements.
And our mission here is to give you the tools you need to cut through that noise. We call it your KaiZen critical thinking toolkit. Actionable stuff.
Yeah, we're going to help you decode these conflicting narratives you see everywhere, understand what the power structures are, actually trying to achieve, and hopefully see the reality behind all the chaos in the headlines. We've laid it all out, from the weird no autopsy thing to the political crackdown that followed.
So, are you ready? Ready to become the Sherlock Holmes of this modern information war? We absolutely believe in your power to analyze this, and we're going to activate it right now. And look, because your insight is so valuable to us, pause this deep dive right now. Go follow our channel, KaiZen, then drop one word in the comments describing how you feel about political discourse today. Seriously, we want to hear it. Okay, let's dive straight into Section 1. The assassination itself, the suspect, and this whole no autopsy mystery. This wasn't hidden away. It happened right out in the open. American Comeback Tour, Utah Valley University UVU campus, September 10th, 2025. Charlie Kirk, the TPUSA co-founder.
And to really get the security picture, you need to visualize it. Kirk's under this big tent, grassy amphitheater area.
Yeah.
And the really chilling part, he was apparently debating gun violence just moments before he was shot.
The irony is just thick, yeah. But what's really astounding and raises immediate questions is the security setup itself. You've got maybe 3,000 people there for one of the most polarizing figures in U.S. politics.
Right, and they did have security. 6 police officers, Kirk's own private detail. That's documented.
But, and this is the kicker, the source is very clear. No metal detectors were used for entry.
None. That's a huge miss, right?
Yeah.
For an event like this, it was ticketed, which suggests they thought about control, but apparently even that wasn't strictly enforced. When you skip basic security like metal detectors for someone this high profile, you're basically leaving the door wide open.
Yeah.
It's the nightmare scenario.
The FBI obviously jumped on this immediately. Director Kash Patel was reportedly heading to the scene. Both the Bureau and Utah DPS labeled it a targeted event right off the bat. This wasn't random.
No way. And the investigation details back that up. Meticulous planning. The suspect, Tyler J. Robinson, 22 years old. They caught him after a manhunt. Not a UVU student, no prior criminal record. But the security footage.
Yeah, tell us about that.
Well, multiple outlets reported on it. Shows Robinson arriving way earlier that morning, like 8:29 a.m., in a gray Dodge Challenger. Yeah. But he was dressed differently, though.
Different how?
Different clothes than when the shooting happened. The suggestion is he changed clothes, maybe on the roof where the shots reportedly came from, and then changed back again afterwards to blend in.
Wow. Okay, so that's not impulsive. That's calculated. That's OPSEC, trying to cover tracks.
Exactly. And then investigators started digging into Robinson's background, and the potential motive starts pointing right back at Kirk's public persona, his whole platform. Robinson was registered to vote, but unaffiliated, no party.
Oh.
But his mother told investigators he'd gotten way more political recently, specifically leaning more to the left and becoming, quote, more pro-gay and trans rights oriented.
Okay, so connect those dots for us. You have Kirk, a conservative activist who, let's be frank, frequently went after the LGBTQ+ community. He specifically attacked policies letting trans people serve in the military.
Right, and the alleged killer is someone whose political awakening seems focused on those exact issues. The motive wasn't buried deep. It seems tied directly into the culture war battles Kirk himself was fighting every day.
Which brings us straight to that first wave of, well, let's call it what it is, misinformation, the no autopsy controversy. Because there wasn't instant, clear official word, the conspiracy theories just took off.
Oh, immediately. You saw it explode on YouTube, other platforms. People weaponized that information gap. Videos screaming, like they just admitted it. No autopsy. Charlie Kirk's body was evidence. What are they hiding? And these things got millions of views.
And the theories ran wild, right? Authorities manipulating evidence, maybe it wasn't a lone shooter, government involved, false flag, all the usual suspects when there's an info vacuum.
And this is exactly where we need to use KaiZen Tool 1. Recognize narrative framing. When a huge, shocking event like this happens, you have to look at that information void, what's filling it. The facts, according to CNN and police statements, were pretty straightforward. Kirk was taken by private car to Timpanogos Regional Hospital. He was pronounced dead there.
So why the controversy? If someone dies from a very obvious traumatic injury, like a gunshot wound, in public on video, does the medical examiner always need an immediate full autopsy just to say, yep, gunshot wound?
Not necessarily for the cause of death, no. That part might be tragically obvious. But the body itself becomes crucial evidence. So there are procedures, chain of custody, forensic analysis, things that take time. The public, though, especially now, wants instant answers. Instant details.
And the speed is key here. That video of the assassination itself, PBS and the New York Times reported, it hit millions almost instantly. That creates this massive public demand for information for closure that just completely outpaces how a careful investigation actually works.
Right. So the lack of immediate, detailed official statements, which, let's be honest, always happens in complex cases, it just became fuel. People assume silence means something's being hidden. Deception.
Shira Frankel at the Times pointed this out, the sheer speed. Videos everywhere, moments after he was shot. Meta, Facebook, they tried to put up some barriers, but X, formerly Twitter, apparently a different approach, she said. It highlights how fragmented, sometimes irresponsible, the handling of violent content is.
It's just a textbook example of information decoding failure. The official channels were slow, the platforms were, well, chaotic, and in that gap, conspiracy thrives instead of procedural understanding.
Okay, so we really want your input here. This is about accountability. If you think the public should get immediate, detailed official info in a case like this, specifically to stop conspiracy theories, even if it might risk messing with the investigation, right? Okay, in the comments right now. Let's see where you stand on transparency versus procedure. All right, let's shift gears. Section 2, the political response and the suppression of dissent. Because this thing pivoted lightning fast from a crime scene to basically a national crisis over free speech orchestrated from the very top.
Yeah, the response from the Trump administration wasn't exactly focused on national unity or mourning. It was swift, it was severe, and it was unapologetically about political leverage. President Trump himself blamed, quote, the radical left group of lunatics for the killing. That set the tone immediately. Vengeance, ideological targeting, even before the suspect's motive was fully nailed down.
He said he'd get that problem solved.
He did. And the scope of the crackdown they threatened was pretty breathtaking. They talked about dismantling liberal groups, going after their donors, claiming they promoted violence, even floated labeling some as terrorist organizations.
Did they name names?
Oh, yeah. Vice President J.D. Vance explicitly said they'd go after nonprofits like Open Society Foundations, the Ford Foundation, big names known for funding liberal and progressive causes. Now, legal experts, the ones the New York Times talked to, were pretty skeptical they could legally pull that off because of the First Amendment.
Right, freedom of association, speech.
Exactly. But the threat itself, that was the point. It's designed to chill speech, to make groups scared, to force them to self-censor.
This felt different, like an escalation. Legal experts were using words like unprecedented crackdown, government censorship, cancel culture, even McCarthyism. And that wasn't just from the left. Some conservatives, like Tucker Carlson, were raising alarms too.
And this is where we absolutely have to pull out KaiZen Tool 2, cross-reference rhetoric in action. This is the free speech test. You have to compare the rhetoric, the value they claim to uphold, like the absolute defense of free speech, often championed by Kirk's own movement, with the actual actions they took to shut down dissent.
And the double standard seems pretty stark. You had Vice President Vance actually hosting Kirk's podcast after the assassination, telling Americans to report people for uncivil speech about Kirk, report them to their employers, to authorities, basically calling for people to get fired.
It created this climate where any criticism of Kirk, or the response, was framed as somehow endorsing the violence, as being complicit.
And the consequences weren't just theoretical threats, they were real, immediate, and dramatic. Across media, academia, even just regular workplaces.
Yeah, the biggest, most public case was probably Jimmy Kimmel Live. Get suspended indefinitely. Kimmel made some comments, partly blaming Trump for the division, later suggesting the Marriage Gang was trying to paint the killer as anything but one of them.
And how did they get ABC to suspend him?
Surgical leverage. The FCC chairman, Brendan Carr, a Trump appointee, started making noise. Threats about FCC action against ABC, maybe even challenging the broadcast licenses for their stations. He claimed Kimmel seemed to directly mislead the American public.
Okay, but actually revoking a major network's licenses, that's a huge step.
They didn't necessarily need to go that far. Here's the mechanism, the crucial part. Nexstar Media Group, a huge media company that owns dozens of local ABC affiliates, they preempted Kimmel's show on 32 of their stations, pulled it off the air for the foreseeable future.
Why would Nexstar do that?
Because at that exact moment, Nexstar was trying to get FCC approval for a massive $6.2 billion deal to buy another media company, Tegna. So the administration didn't need to actually pull the trigger on license revocation. Just the threat or even the hint of delaying that multi-billion-dollar merger approval was enough to get immediate corporate compliance, censorship through regulatory intimidation.
Wow, chilling.
It is. And that chill spread right into universities and schools. Sources talk about hundreds of professors, teachers across the country getting fired, suspended, investigated for stuff they posted on social media. Comments seen as critical or even just callous about Kirk's death.
Greg Abbott in Texas announced, what, nearly 300 teachers under investigation there alone?
Yeah, and you saw these high-profile firings pop up everywhere. A DC Comics writer lost a gig over a post, a Carolina Panthers staffer, a Phoenix Suns reporter, boom, gone. The whole private sector suddenly felt like a minefield. One wrong tweet, amplified by online conservative groups doing the doxing and flagging, could cost you your job.
Okay, now, intellectual honesty is key here at KaiZen. We have to put this crackdown in context. The administration's focus, their blame, their actions, all aimed squarely at the radical left.
Right, but let's look at the actual nonpartisan data on political violence in the U.S. Historically, cumulatively, over decades, the vast majority of extremist killings have been carried out by right-wing perpetrators.
And even more recently.
Even more sharply. According to documented research, between 2022 and the end of 2024, every single one of the 61 known political killings in the U.S. was committed by right-wing extremists.
Yeah.
All 61.
So let's unpack that. An act of violence allegedly committed by one individual leaning left, Robinson,
is used to justify this sweeping crackdown against the entire progressive movement, its funding, its speech.
Even though the data, the historical record, shows overwhelmingly that political violence in the U.S. has come from the right.
Precisely. The political strategy just completely overrode the factual context. It tells you that when power wants to consolidate, tragedy isn't a moment for reflection or objective justice. It's a tool, an opportunity to redefine dissent as disloyalty, even treason. That's the pattern you need to learn to spot.
Okay, for everyone listening, did this systemic targeting, this level of censorship after the assassination, did it surprise you? If it did, just write, wow, in the comments. We're curious.
Yeah.
Let's move now to Section 3, the memorial service itself. Because this wasn't just a funeral held at State Farm Stadium, huge venue. It became this massive political rally and honestly a kind of theological battleground too. DHS even classified it as an event of highest national significance.
Think about that. Highest national significance. That's usually reserved for, like, the Super Bowl, a presidential inauguration.
So Super Bowl level security for a memorial service.
Yeah. It really shows how tense, how fragile things felt. Reports said speakers were often behind bulletproof glass. But the rhetoric inside that stadium was pulling the nation in completely opposite directions.
The emotional center, though, the moment that really resonated for many, came from Erica Kirk, Charlie's widow, and just named the new CEO of TPUSA.
Absolutely. She stood up there and publicly forgave Tyler Robinson, the man accused of killing her husband. Just said, that young man, I forgive him.
And she explicitly grounded it in her Christian faith, right? Mentioning the Ephesians 5 model of marriage she shared with Charlie, emphasizing faith, family. And she confirmed she would not seek the death penalty, citing, love our enemies.
It was a radical act of grace, really. And it sparked this huge debate. Is that what faith demands? How does that square with the public's desire for justice? Many Christian commentators lauded it, saying it was a true example of Christ's teachings. Forgiveness frees the forgiver from bitterness, from hate.
But does forgiveness mean you don't want justice?
Not necessarily. The analysis often distinguishes them. True forgiveness, in this theological view, means letting go of personal hatred and the desire for revenge. It doesn't mean you don't want the legal system to work, to hold the person accountable. It's about transforming that desire for justice, releasing the personal spiritual debt, if you will. As one theologian put it, it changes your heart, lets you move from trauma to clarity.
Okay, so that's Erica Kirk's message. Deeply personal, faith-driven grace. Now contrast that sharply, with the messages from the political leaders who spoke right alongside her. President Trump spoke before and after her.
And his message couldn't have been more different. He literally said, I hate my opponents and I don't want the best for them. Flat out. He called the killer a radicalized, cold-blooded monster. He called Kirk a martyr now for American freedom. It felt less like a memorial, more like a political mobilization.
And then there was that pivot, using the memorial service stage to announce a major new political initiative about finding an answer to autism, calling it MHA, Make America Healthy Again.
Yeah, that was something. And Vice President Vance echoed the more confrontational tone. He warned people against having a fake kumbaya moment, reminding them that evil still walks among us. It perfectly captured that tension. Individual grace versus collective political combat.
And Stephen Miller, the deputy chief of staff, gave this fiery speech, right, aiming at perceived political enemies, calling for the crowd's righteous fury against the forces of wickedness and evil.
The leadership actively seemed to be trying to overwrite Erica Kirk's message of forgiveness with a call to ideological arms. And this clash, this is precisely where you need KaiZen Tool 4. Distinguish personal emotion from political strategy. You have to see the difference between Erica Kirk's profound, personal act of a genuine moment of faith, whatever you think of the politics, and the calculated use of that same event by political leaders for their own strategic goals. Mobilizing the base, fundraising, setting the agenda, personal faith becomes political leverage.
Okay, audience, let's try and simplify this complex debate for a second. Based on what you've heard, do you think genuine forgiveness requires rejecting the pursuit of legal justice? Write N for no or Y for yes in the comments. How do you see that relationship between spiritual grace and legal consequences? Let us know. All right, section 4. Let's try to deconstruct the legacy Charlie Kirk leaves behind and really lock in how to use this KaiZen toolkit. To grasp the sheer scale of the fallout, you have to understand who Kirk was, this complex, powerful figure, and the incredible political and financial machine he built.
Yeah, after his death, his allies immediately started framing him as this champion of civil debate, grassroots power. Debate is the great clarifier. The idea he believed in winning at the ballot box, that he was this sort of missionary figure who didn't actually hate his opponents.
That was one narrative. But there was a very strong counter-narrative from critics, wasn't there? One that helps explain why the reaction was so incredibly divided?
Absolutely. Critics pointed out that his campus debates often weren't good faith discussions at all. They were described as aggressive, unequal trolling affairs, deliberately designed to provoke undergrads, often shout them down, and generate viral clips. Rage bait content for his base.
Moira Donegan called them a mockery of deliberation. Staged events designed to humiliate liberals, generate clicks, rather than find common ground. Former debaters said his goal was just to verbally defeat people and then capitalize on the online reaction.
And this trolling often platformed his most extreme, controversial views. The views his allies are now trying to, frankly, whitewash. We're talking about things like opposing the 1964 Civil Rights Act, regularly promoting the Great Replacement conspiracy theory, this idea that elites are deliberately replacing white Americans.
He also criticized Martin Luther King Jr., right? Called him awful and not a good person.
Yeah. And that infamous Jubilee media appearance, the Surrounded episode, where he argued abortion should be illegal even for a 10-year-old rape victim. His public image wasn't just conservative. It was built on being relentlessly provocative, calculated performance art designed to create friction. Understanding that performance is crucial to understanding why his death triggered both intense grief and intense public backlash, which then fueled that massive suppression campaign we talked about.
And critically, he didn't just leave behind ideas. He left behind a massive, highly structured political infrastructure, a machine that can run without him. This is where KaiZen Tool 3, Identify the Financial Engine, comes in. You have to follow the money.
Right. Turning Point USA, TPUSA, it's huge. Registered as a 501c3, that's the tax-deductible, educational nonprofit designation. Huge reach. They reported $85 million in revenue in 2023.
$85 million? That's enormous for a nonprofit like that.
It's massive. Comparable to some national political party committees, it shows you the financial muscle. It's like a parallel political party structure.
But that's not the only piece, is it? There's Turning Point Action, TPA.
Exactly. And the structure here is key. TPA is a 501c. That's a social welfare organization. The crucial difference, C4s can do political work, lobbying, campaigning, but they don't have to disclose their donors.
Ah, the Dirk money arm.
Pretty much. TPA was involved in things like busing people to D.C. for January 6th. They faced FEC complaints about not disclosing donors for election spending back in 2020. Their revenue in one recent year was over $11 million, all listed as contributions and grants from undisclosed sources. This setup lets the C3 raise tax-deductible funds for education, while the C4 deploys political muscle using anonymous money. It guarantees long-term influence way beyond audience trends.
And there's a third part too, TPUSA Faith.
Yeah, focus specifically on recruiting pastors, church leaders into political action, explicitly pushing Christian nationalism. They talk about the Seven Mountain Mandate.
Explain that briefly for people who haven't heard of it.
Sure. It's this idea, influential in some evangelical circles, that Christians need to gain control over 7 key areas or mountains of society. Things like government, media, education, family, business, arts, religion, to establish God's kingdom on earth, essentially. TPUSA Faith had a prospectus showing a $6.4 million budget just to address America's crumbling religious foundation. It shows the depth of the ideology and the serious money behind linking faith and political power.
So this massive, well-funded, diversified machine, that's what Erica Kirk inherited when she was named CEO.
Exactly. And she champions that Ephesians 5 marriage model, connecting faith and family. The TPUSA board statement was explicit. They said the attempt to destroy Charlie's work would be their chance to make it more powerful and enduring than ever before. The tragedy wasn't a setback, it was framed as an accelerator.
It really demonstrates the power of having that infrastructure ready to go. It's not a pause, it's just continuing the mission, maybe even turbocharging it, using both the faith appeal and all that dark money.
Yeah.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground, a lot of conflicting information. Let's solidify the learning. Let's pull out that KaiZen critical thinking toolkit again.
4 simple steps, actionable things you can use right away to get clarity in this kind of information storm.
Tool 1, recognize narrative framing. First thing you do when a big event happens, look who's being lifted up. Kirk is a martyr, a patriot. And who's being torn down? The radical left lunatics. Spotting those frames helps you see past the immediate emotion to the political game being played.
Tool 2, cross-reference rhetoric and action, the free speech test we talked about. Compare what they say they value, like absolute free speech, with what they actually do. The FCC threats, Nexstar folding, the firings. It shows that, for those in power, their free speech often stops exactly where criticism of them starts.
Tool 3, identify the financial engine. Don't get lost just following the personalities or the headlines. Follow the money. The nonprofit, C3, cash, the dark money, C4, cash, the whole complex infrastructure. That engine is built for long-term influence, regardless of who's currently in the spotlight.
And finally, tool 4, distinguish personal emotion from political strategy. This was so clear at the memorial. You have to separate Erica Kirk's personal act of forgiveness, a powerful human moment, from the way political leaders immediately use that same event for their own gain. Fundraising, mobilizing, electioneering. The second forgiveness becomes a political tool. It's not just grace anymore, it's leverage.
And that contrasts the forgiveness right next to the vengeance that's maybe the most powerful, lasting lesson from this whole deep dive. You, our listener, you now have the tools to analyze this stuff, to see how faith, politics, media control, and big money all intersect in these critical moments.
We really navigated a storm here, didn't we? A single violent act blew the lid off these deep cracks already running through America. Speech, justice, truth itself. Think about it. The alleged killer leans left, supposedly motivated by Kirk's own rhetoric. Kirk's allies blame the radical left and unleash censorship. Kirk's widow forgives based on Christian principles, and political leaders at the same event demand revenge and conformity.
So the final thought, the provocative question we leave you with is this. What does it say about the state of things when forgiveness itself can be weaponized, while rhetoric that fuels division is defended? That's where tool 4 becomes essential. Distinguishing genuine emotion from calculated strategy isn't just smart. It feels like survival sometimes.
Look, knowledge is power. We truly believe that. But action, that's optimized knowledge. If this deep dive helped you cut through some of the noise, you need to act on that insight. We value your intellect immensely. Use it.
So pause this right now. Share this deep dive with just one person. One person who you think needs to see the difference between a political rally and reality. And let us know in the comments. Which of those 4 KaiZen tools, 1, 2, 3, or 4, do you think is the most vital for navigating the news right now? Just drop the number. We really want to know what you think. We'll see you for the next deep dive into the truth.